This episode was produced using AI-generated voices and scripting. Okay, so here's what I keep coming back to. Everyone's talking about the Stargate project like it's this crown jewel of American AI infrastructure. $500 billion. The president announced it in the White House, and the people who were supposed to build it are leaving.
Not just leaving, going to Meta, which is, I mean, that's the part that should make people uncomfortable. These aren't random engineers looking for a raise. We're talking about two senior executives from the Stargate joint venture itself, Brett Callow and Alexander Govea. Callow was head of infrastructure strategy. Govea was leading data center site selection. These are the people who know where the compute is going, literally geographically, and they're walking across the street to Zuckerberg.
And that is not just hiring them into existing roles. They created a whole new unit for this.
Right? Meta's calling it the Compute Infrastructure Group. Brand new org reporting directly to Susan Lee, their CFO. That's not a hiring spree, that's a strategic build-out. When you have infrastructure execs reporting to your CFO, you're saying, this is a capital allocation priority at the highest level.
Okay, but hang on. People move between companies in tech all the time. Senior people. What makes this different from normal Silicon Valley musical chairs?
Because of what Stargate is supposed to be. This isn't poaching from Google Cloud or whatever. Stargate is a joint venture between OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle, and reportedly some sovereign wealth money. It was announced as the single largest AI infrastructure commitment ever. $500 billion over 4 years. And the people with the institutional knowledge of how to actually execute that, the site strategy, the power procurement, the construction sequencing, are now going to build the exact same thing for Meta instead.
So, Meta's basically getting a cheat code.
It's worse than a cheat code. They're getting the playbook and the people who wrote it. And nobody's saying this, Meta already spends more on CapEx than almost anyone in AI. They guided 60 to 65 billion in capital expenditure for 2025 alone. That's before this new unit even gets ramped up.
Wait, seriously? 65 billion in 1 year?
That's the high end of guidance, yeah? And a huge chunk of that is going to data centers and GPUs. So when people talk about Stargate like it's this unprecedented thing, look, Meta's already spending at roughly that annualized pace. They just don't have a White House press conference about it.
That's the whole game right there. Meta doesn't need the branding. They need the capacity.
Exactly. And here's what I think is actually going on. Meta's been running Llama models, their open source family. Llama 3, Llama 4 coming. They've been credible, but they've still been licensing or benchmarking against OpenAI's frontier models for some internal use cases. The play here isn't just build more data centers, it's build enough compute that we never need to depend on anyone else's models again. Full vertical integration. Their own silicon, their own training clusters, their own inference fleet.
So, this is an independence move, not a competitive move?
It's both, but the independence part comes first. If you're Meta and you're deploying AI across Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, that's 3+ billion users. You cannot afford to have your AI strategy depend on API calls to a company that also competes with you. That's an existential vulnerability.
Which, honestly, I think people underestimate how weird the current arrangement is. Meta using OpenAI models for anything is like Ford buying engines from Toyota.
It's exactly that weird, and it's been an open secret that Zuckerberg finds the whole situation intolerable. There were reports last year that he personally greenlit basically unlimited budget for AI infrastructure. The Compute Infrastructure Group is just the organizational manifestation of that.
Alright, so let me push back on the doom and gloom framing for Stargate though. 2 people leaving? Even senior people. That doesn't kill a $500 billion project. They can hire replacements.
They can, but this is a signaling problem more than a personnel problem. When your top infrastructure strategy guy leaves for a competitor before you've even broken ground on most of the planned sites, that tells the market something. It tells investors something. It tells the other partners in the JV something.
What does it tell them?
But the execution risk on Stargate is higher than the press conference suggested. And, I mean, think about who's actually in that joint venture. SoftBank's the lead funder, Oracle's providing cloud infrastructure. OpenAI is supposed to be the anchor tenant for the compute. But SoftBank has a history of, let's be charitable, ambitious timelines, and Oracle is not exactly the first name you think of when you think cutting-edge AI infrastructure.
Right, Oracle is the company your company uses because someone signed a contract in 2009.
I mean, they've gotten better, but yeah. And then there's the basic math problem. 500 billion over 4 years means you need to be deploying roughly 125 billion a year in capex. That's more than any single entity has ever spent on infrastructure annually. Even Meta's 65 billion number, which is already eye-popping, is about half that pace.
So Stargate might have always been partly aspirational.
That's not what's happening in public, but I think privately, a lot of people in the industry have been skeptical about the execution timeline. And these departures are the first visible crack.
Okay, here's my contrarian take on this whole thing. Everyone's framing Meta as the winner here. Meta poaches the talent, Meta builds the infrastructure, Meta wins. But what if Meta's actually the one making the mistake?
Go on.
Meta's spending tens of billions, maybe heading toward 100 billion, on infrastructure for AI products that are mostly better ad targeting, chatbots and Instagram DMs. What's the revenue model that justifies this?
Okay, that's a fair challenge, but the actual number is something like Meta makes 160 billion a year in revenue, almost all advertising. If AI-driven improvements in ad targeting and content recommendation move the needle even 5% on that, you're talking $8 billion of incremental annual revenue. That's conservative. The argument internally is that AI is the single biggest lever they have for
But they were already doing machine learning for ads. They've been doing that for a decade. What's
scale. It's about scale of the models. The difference between a recommendation system trained on a few billion parameters and one trained on a few hundred billion parameters is not linear. It's the quality of predictions, the personalization, the ability to do real-time inference across billions of interactions. That requires compute that simply didn't exist at this price point 5 years ago.
fair? But there's a version of this story where Meta builds all this infrastructure and then the models plateau. Like, what if scaling laws start to break down and you've got $100 billion worth of GPUs sitting there?
Then you rent it out. That's actually one of the interesting subtexts here. Meta's historically been a consumption-only compute company. They build for themselves. But there have been signals that they're at least considering offering compute to third parties. If you've got enough capacity, you become a cloud provider whether you plan to or not.
Meta as a cloud company. That would be wild.
It would be a complete transformation of their business model. And honestly, the compute infrastructure group reporting to the CFO rather than the CTO kind of hints at that. If it was purely about internal R&D, you'd put it under engineering. Under the CFO, it's a business.
Okay, that's actually a really good point. Let me ask you something else though. You mentioned Llama earlier. Meta's whole AI model strategy is open source, or open weight technically. How does that interact with this infrastructure play?
This is where it gets really interesting and nobody's connecting the dots. If Meta has the most compute capacity in the industry, and with these hires they're clearly trying to get there, they also have the most widely adopted open weight model family in Llama, they've basically created a flywheel. More people use Llama, more people build on Meta's ecosystem, more data flows back, they train better models, they deploy on their own infrastructure.
So the open source thing isn't altruism.
It never was. It's a distribution strategy. Same way Google open sourced Android to control mobile. Meta open sources Llama to make it the default model that everyone fine-tunes and deploys. And if they also control the infrastructure layer, they control the whole stack without anyone feeling locked in.
Which is kind of the opposite of what OpenAI is doing. OpenAI's strategy is proprietary models, API access, premium pricing. They need Stargate because they need to host all of that themselves.
Right. And this is why the executive departures are so pointed. OpenAI's model requires them to be the compute provider. They can't have customers running GPT-5 on their own hardware. That would kill the business model. So Stargate isn't just nice to have for OpenAI. It's existential. They need dedicated, massive-scale infrastructure that they control. Losing the people who are going to build it, that's a real problem.
Okay, but hang on. You said earlier that two people leaving doesn't kill the project? Now you're saying it's existential.
No, I said the infrastructure is existential. The departures are a symptom. The question is what's driving the symptom? And I think the answer is that Meta's offering something Stargate can't. Speed, decisiveness, and a single decision maker. Zuckerberg can write a check tomorrow. Stargate's a joint venture with multiple partners, multiple stakeholders, probably endless committee meetings about
So, it's a governance problem.
partially. Joint ventures in general are just slower. You've got SoftBank's capital allocation timeline, Oracle's technical constraints, OpenAI's evolving compute needs. These Stargate execs probably looked at that and looked at Meta, where one guy can just say, build it, and the choice was obvious.
The Zuckerberg dictator advantage.
I mean, dual class share structure has its perks. He's got super voting shares. Nobody can tell him no. In this case, that's actually an asset.
There's a weird irony here. 3 years ago, everyone was roasting Zuckerberg for the metaverse spending. Reality Labs lost. What was it, 16 billion in 1 year? And now the same kind of massive capital deployment on AI is being praised.
Because the market is seeing returns this time, Meta stock roughly quadrupled from its 2022 low. The AI integration into their ad products is actually working. Revenue's growing. So when he says, I'm going to spend 65 billion on infrastructure, Wall Street says, okay, you've earned the benefit of the doubt, which is, a very different response than 2 years ago.
And OpenAI's in the opposite position. They keep raising money at higher and higher valuations. 300 billion was the last number I saw, but they're not profitable. They're burning cash, and now their infrastructure partners are losing key people.
The 300 billion valuation is based entirely on future expectations. Revenues reportedly around 4 billion annualized, maybe a bit higher now. That's a 75 times revenue multiple, which is insane by any historical standard. And the bull case depends on them having enough compute to serve all the customers they're promised.
Without Stargate fully built out.
The capacity constrained. They're already capacity constrained. Sam Altman has said publicly that they can't serve all the demand. That's why Stargate matters so much and why losing infrastructure talent hurts more than it would at any other company.
Let me throw something else at you. What about the national security angle? Stargate was announced at the White House. Trump was there. There's this whole narrative about American AI dominance and keeping compute on US soil. If Stargate stumbles and Meta becomes the dominant compute player, does the government care?
They should care, but probably not in the way you'd think. Meta's building in the US too. They've got data centers in Iowa, Oregon, Texas. They're expanding everywhere. So the American compute narrative doesn't really change. What changes is who controls it. And honestly, from a national security perspective, having one company control that much critical infrastructure might actually be worse than a diversified joint venture.
Concentration risk.
Exactly. If Meta becomes the single largest holder of AI compute in the Western world, which at their current trajectory is plausible within 3 to 5 years, that's a concentration of power that should make people nervous. And nobody's saying this, but it should make regulators nervous too.
And yet, the FTC is busy suing Meta over Instagram and WhatsApp acquisitions from a decade ago, instead of thinking about this.
Regulators are always fighting the last war. Always.
Okay, so let me try to synthesize where we're at. Stargate's losing talent to Meta. Meta's building a dedicated compute unit with experienced infrastructure people. Meta's already spending at a pace that rivals what Stargate promised. And the structural advantages: single decision maker, open source model strategy, massive existing user base, all favor Meta in this race.
I'd add one more thing. The talent flow is a leading indicator. If we see more Stargate people leave in the next 6 months, and I'd bet money we will, the narrative around that project shifts from biggest AI infrastructure play ever to troubled joint venture losing momentum. And that becomes self-reinforcing. More uncertainty means more departures means more uncertainty.
A doom loop.
For Stargate, potentially. For the industry overall, it just means the compute race is being won by the company with the simplest org chart and the biggest existing revenue base to fund it.
Which is a deeply unsexy conclusion. The future of AI infrastructure comes down to organizational efficiency and advertising revenue.
Welcome to how technology actually works. It's never the most visionary company that wins. It's the one that can write the checks and execute. And right now, on both of those dimensions, Meta's in a better position than anyone wants to admit.
Okay, but you said something earlier about scaling laws potentially plateauing. Play that out for me. If Meta builds all this infrastructure and then the models stop improving at the same rate,
Then they've still got the best ad targeting infrastructure in history. That's the asymmetry people miss. Meta's downside case on this investment is we made our core business slightly more efficient. OpenAI's downside case is we don't exist. The risk profiles are completely different.
that's the whole game right there. Meta can afford to be wrong about AGI. OpenAI can't.
Right. And when you're hiring infrastructure executives, That asymmetry matters. Going to work at Meta means you're building something that has a guaranteed use case regardless of where AI goes. Going to work at Stargate means you're betting that OpenAI's specific vision of the future is correct and that a complex joint venture can execute on it.
When you put it that way, it's almost surprising only 2 execs have left so far.
Give it time.
You really think this is just the beginning?
I think 6 months from now, we're going to look back at this moment and say, oh, that's when the power shifted. Not because of any single model breakthrough or product launch, because the infrastructure layer is where the real leverage is, and Meta just signaled they're going all in on owning it.
The boring layer.
The boring layer that everything else depends on. Yeah.
All right. Data centers, CFO reporting lines, and site selection executives. Somehow the most consequential AI story of the year.
And nobody's talking about it, which is usually how you know it matters.